What we're going to talk about today on the History Fix is that horny old question, what exactly is feudalism? The way I left it last time was I was stressing how the societies which existed, the class-based societies which existed between the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution, whether in the ancient world or the medieval world, were all fundamentally similar in that they involved a ruling class extracting surplus from the labour of agricultural workers, however they were defined. But what I also said was that there was a huge variety of different types of society represented across the world in that huge, great period of time. And I ended by saying, particularly important for our purposes is to try and get to grips with what we mean by feudalism. And I suggested at the end last time that feudalism is really best understood as a military system rather than a social system. Now let me provide a little bit of theoretical background for that claim. And it's based on this observation that if we go back before the Industrial Revolution and before the development of capitalism, which is based to a very large degree on economic competition between different companies, accumulating capital and competing with each other for market share. If we go back before our own society and we look at pre-capitalist, pre-modern societies, competition between different elites, different states, wasn't really economic, first and foremost. It was political and military. It depended first and foremost on military power. It depended on armies. Building armies was the main business of the state. Making war, or at least preparing for war, was the main business of the pre-modern state. And feudalism is best understood as a particular way of creating armies and making war. There are really three ways in which you can create an army if you are in a pre-industrial economy. You can do it by controlling territory so effectively that you can collect lots of tax revenue, lots of tribute from the peasantry, and you can recycle that as payments to soldiers who are effectively mercenaries, effectively professional soldiers who are fighting for pay. An example of that would be the armies that were fielded by the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, for example, which were really being paid for out of the taxes being levied on the farmers along the banks of the Nile and in the Nile Delta. Another example would be the Roman Empire, where the Roman emperor was levying taxes across the whole of the empire, and he was then using those tax revenues to maintain a professional army of full-time soldiers, about 250,000 strong in the 2nd century AD. So that's one way you can do it. Another way you can build an army in a pre-industrial society is you can impose on the population as a whole, or a large proportion of the population, an obligation to do military service, to serve in a state militia. And again, I'll give you a couple of examples, different examples from different times and places. Ancient Greece in the 5th and the 4th century BC was largely based on the raising of citizen militias, where each able-bodied man who was a citizen of a particular city-state, he had an obligation to do military service. Or another example would be Anglo-Saxon England, where the Anglo-Saxon kings imposed an obligation to do military service on all free men. So these are, if you like, these are city-state or royal militias. And there's a third way, and this is what brings us finally to the question of feudalism. What you could do is you could divide up the land into a series of estates. You could allocate those states on the basis that whoever is granted a particular estate can enjoy the produce of the estate in return for doing military service. So it's land for service, land for service in the king's army when the king chooses to mobilise his feudal host. That's the essence, really, of the feudal system. And I'm going to try and flesh it out by focusing on one very clear-cut example of the feudal system. I'm going to take the Normans, who were hugely important in the history of medieval Europe between the 10th and the 12th centuries AD. And the Normans they settle in Normandy in what is now northern France, originally as invading Vikings. They're actually originally from Scandinavia. They settle in Normandy. They divide up Normandy among themselves. They're essentially a warrior elite dividing up the land, and each member of this community is then drawing resources from his own estate, and he holds that estate and he benefits from the resources provided by the estate in return for doing military service to the king. And in fact, there's a hierarchy, a feudal hierarchy, where the king, in fact the Duke specifically, is the Duke of Normandy. Later that he becomes the King of England, but at the time he's the Duke of Normandy. What he does is he allocates big chunks of land to his leading barons, and his leading barons then subdivide their estates into a series of individual fiefs, as they were called, and each fief is capable of supporting a single knight, a knight being a heavily armoured horseman who fights as heavy cavalry in the feudal host. And when the Duke of Normandy wants to mobilise his army, he sends out his instruction to mobilise to his barons, and his barons in turn send out their instructions to the individual knights, and the result, as they all come together at an appointed place on an appointed day, is a feudal army of several hundred, possibly several thousand in some cases, heavily armoured horsemen. That's the essence of the way in which the feudal system works. Military service on demand in return for holding land. Now, this is a way of raising an army, but it's also an extremely unstable system. Two particular reasons why medieval feudalism is unstable. First of all, because it means a division of the world into competing feudal states, rival kings, rival dukes, rival barons, all of them potentially capable of raising armies among those lesser members of the feudal nobility who owe allegiance to them. And of course, the competition for land between these rival potentates is driven by the fact that land is the basis of power. The basis of power because the more land you have, the more knights you have, the bigger your armies will be. It's a competitive process. It's also an unstable system because in order to maintain the integrity of the individual fiefs, they have to remain single parcels of land. They can't be subdivided, because if you start subdividing the individual fiefs, then none of the fiefs are large enough to support a feudal knight. So you have a rule of primogeniture. And the rule of primogeniture is that the eldest son inherits the fief. And that means that younger sons face the possibility that they will lose their status as part of the feudal warrior elite because they don't have a fief of their own. So what the feudal system tends to do is to produce surplus violence or surplus potential violence. That makes it unstable. It also makes it dynamic and expansionist. And again, the Normans are a supreme example of that. The Normans, having established the Duchy of Normandy in the course of the 10th century, they then embark on campaigns of conquest in northern France in the early parts of the 11th century, and then, most famously, they launch an invasion of England, and in 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, they overturn the Anglo-Saxon state, and Duke William of Normandy becomes King William of England. But it's not just that they're expanding into England at this time. They're also, and this is less well known, they're also at the same time infiltrating into southern Italy, and the Normans in fact take control of southern Italy at round about the same time as they take control of England, and they then invade and take over Sicily as well. All of this happening in the 11th century, and at the end of the 11th century, the Normans are central to the first crusade, the first of these great expeditions by Western feudal knights, Western feudal chivalry, where they carry their military power, their potential violence into the Middle East, where they set out to create new feudal kingdoms in the Middle East. And we have a 200-year history of struggle between the Muslims of the Middle East on one side and Western Christian knights on the other. Now, I've talked at some length in this episode of the History Fix about feudalism, about European feudalism. I've stressed the fact that it's a very unstable and dynamic system, and the reason I focused on it is because it is central to understanding the rise of Europe in the medieval period, to the point where Europe becomes the dominant continent in what is increasingly a globalized system. We're going to consider more deeply the way in which the feudal system in Europe develops during the medieval period as we try to get to grips with the emergence of Europe as the economic, social and political powerhouse of the world economy in the early modern period. That's the History Fix next time. We are facing the greatest crisis in the history of humanity. Capitalism is driving us towards climate catastrophe. To understand how we got here and how we get out of it, we really need to understand human history. What we're trying to do here at the History Fix is to give us the understanding of the past that we need to equip us to fight for a better future. If you like what we're doing, please share and subscribe, and also contribute to our Patreon page. Thanks very much.